I'm going to do something that's extremely difficult for me. You see, I teach American history, and I don't mind telling you that my favorite era of American history is the time between 1757 and 1810, which covers the French and Indian War through the Revolution on to the end of President Jefferson's term. Now, most historians call that the Federalist era, when it actually begins a little bit before and goes a little bit after. But anyway, I usually spend a lot of time on those two conflicts and the beginnings of our new country. But since this is Black American history, I'm going to have to keep those decades a little brief. As I said, that's going to be difficult for me to do, but I will accomplish it. Why, you ask? As well as you should. Because most of the information we have at that time period covers the political problems, the decisions of the leaders, and the battles. Now, African Americans were there, of course, but not in a commanding role, or do we have an awful lot of personal information about them? What we do have is the general information of the blacks as a group, with some personal stories. Now, they were considered chattel property, and as such, most of the information we have comes down from the white man's point of view. Also, most of the slaves at that time couldn't read or write, so we've got darn few personal written records. Now, I'm going to be giving you some information not in the text as background information, and you may think it's relating to just the white participants of the war, but indirectly it's going to also cover the black population. That being said, Chapter 5, Give Me Liberty. Rhetorical question, folks. Do you know the meaning of the word paradox? It means inconsistency, contradiction, or contradiction in terms. For instance, like saying Daniel Boone was a great Indian killer, when he admitted in his biography that he had only killed 2 Indians in his life. So the paradox of slavery and freedom refers to the statements that life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness is not for all Americans, only for those that were white. And of course, Patrick Henry, one of our earliest great orators, when he shouted, "Give me liberty or give me death," well, that was only a portion of the entire statement. And I am assuming that you picked up on it when you read that I'm going to quote, "Is life so dear or peace so sweet as to be purchased at the price of chains and slavery," unquote. Of course, he was talking about the English colonists being enslaved just as the black people were. Now, like I said, I will be brief, but you do need to have some background information on what was going on. The nation of France is claiming all of this area called Canada. Now, this is the Mississippi River. She's claiming the Mississippi River. She claims the Ohio River and the area south of the Ohio River, which is Kentucky, and all this area in here that's going to be the future states of like Indiana, Illinois, Ohio, Michigan, and Wisconsin. Now, Spain claims Florida and the area that we're going to later call Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana, and on down into Mexico and Central and South America. She also tentatively claims this area out here. Then you've got the English colonists. They're right here along the coastline. And because of a charter given to them by the king many years ago, they're claiming everything from the Atlantic all the way across to the Pacific. So you've got 3 nations that are claiming pretty much the same area of land. So you begin to see the problem. Now, France and Spain and England are the major European powers at this time. France and Spain are Catholic, and they are allies. England is Protestant and a major sea power that calls herself the Queen of the Seas. And they've been at war with each other numerous times. And now we're going to go to war over land claims in North America. Now, in Europe, it's called the 7 Years' War. Here in the colonies, it's called the French and Indian War. Now, because France and Spain are allies, anything France does, Spain goes along with. France needed that Mississippi River for communication and transportation to her little colony on the Gulf of New Orleans. She also wanted that area of the Ohio River Valley for fur trade. Well, England claims both, so we're going to have war. And wars in Europe are strange. You know, sometimes when you go to war, you kill these people and you destroy property and destroy land. And when the war's over, things go back pretty much to the way they were before the war. And France and England had been at war before, and England had even captured some things in Canada, but after the war, they gave them back. But this time, things are going to be different. England has won the war and as such sets the treaty terms. And her terms are France gets out of the New World totally. So we get all of Canada. Well, as I said, France and Spain are allies, and although Spain did not send anybody over here to fight, she was an ally of France, and she did declare war on England, so she's got to be punished too. So consequently, we take Florida away from Spain. So as you can see, everything here east of the Mississippi River, from all of known Canada, all the way down to Florida, is now belongs to England. And that's a lot of acres, folks. Now, all this red over in here, Central America and the Midwest, and all the way up the Canadian coast up into even Alaska, Spain is tentatively claiming. But we got a problem there too, because Russia's also claiming that area. So everything in gold is English. Everything in red is claimed by the Spanish, and the gray is not claimed at all. It's unexplored. Well, the question comes up, how are you going to manage all that area? Now, I know this sounds redundant, but Canada had been occupied by the French. Consequently, they spoke pretty much the French language, and they were Catholic. They had different laws. For instance, in the colonies, the English law was that you would be tried by a jury of your peers. They did not have that in Canada. And the French, well, they respected the native inhabitants. They gave them gifts when they visited. They didn't mind living with them and would intermarry with their women and respected some of their customs. Another question would come up with who's going to gain the fur trade? And since the English did not respect the Indians, they were only nice to them because the French were there. And the Indians loved the French. But if the English had not given gifts and been halfway decent to them, even though they considered them heathens, they wouldn't have had any allies in Indians at all. So not being sure what's going to happen, the first thing that England does is tell all the colonists to get back east of the mountains. No more trade with the Indians, no more buying land, no more anything. Now, I know that you don't think about the cost of war, but wars cost a lot of money, and who's going to pay for it? Well, the government, or in this case, the crown. The businesses who sell supplies to the military, like ammunition and things like that, uniforms, they make money. But the crown has to pay, and they've also got to pay the salaries of the military. Another question was, how was Canada going to be governed? And what are the Indians going to do now that they realize that the French are gone for good? And I don't know. The English troops were left in the colonies to protect the colonists because we didn't have a police force, and they even sent more over. Now, King George III in Parliament passed some revenue bills because they got to have help paying for this large cost of the war. And of course, as soon as the people in the colonies heard about it, they started screaming taxation without representation. We make our own laws. We do our own taxes. Now, up until 1763, yes, the crown had passed some tariff laws, but that's a long, big ocean out there. And sometimes it'd be as much as 6 months before we even knew what was going on in England. So if we didn't like one of these new laws, we just ignored it. And it became a game. Smuggling became a kind of respected profession. And the game was to outsmart the English taxman. And we had some pretty famous smugglers. But all the British citizens had to pay. Whether you were in Ireland or Scotland or wherever you were a member of the British Empire, you had to pay. Even in London, the English in the actual island had to pay. But we were the only ones that objected. We said, you know, we made our own laws, made our own taxes, we ruled ourselves for the last 100 years, and all England's trying to do is to enslave us. They're going to treat us like women and children and slaves who have no rights at all. I don't think we can understand the importance of property in the 21st century, but if you own property, you can vote. If you own property, you can support your family. If you own property, you are a free man, and the government can't take your property. The only way you can lose your property is if you incur a debt that you can't pay. And slaves, of course, are considered property because they've been bought and paid for. Now, our founding fathers were very much devoted to freedom for all whites. And of course, that does not even elevate the whites above all the black slaves, which is another American paradox. Now, Samuel Johnson, he happened to be an Englishman who lived in England. He said, you know, how is it that we hear the loudest yelps of liberty among the drivers of slaves. Another paradox. But we're starting to see also the beginnings of anti-slavery movement in the middle colonies, primarily in Pennsylvania, the Society of Friends or the Quakers. And even that Englishman who came over here because he couldn't like the English, Thomas Paine, who wrote that infamous or famous document. He believed that slavery was murder, robbery, lewdness, and barbarity. Common sense. And then, well, I had a little bit of trouble. Were there some blacks suing for freedom in Massachusetts? Yes. Were there blacks who knew what was going on about the movement? Yeah. In Massachusetts, but you've got more free blacks up there. You've got more blacks that can read. It's a smaller population, yes, but they're much more integrated into the society. And did some of them sue for freedom? Yes, but that was not the norm. Like I said, in 20 years, maybe 90 of them or 30 of them got their freedom. It's not the norm. And the ones in the South weren't even really sure what's going on. They couldn't read, they couldn't write, and the news had not trickled down south yet. I don't deny that there was some things going on, but it was not the norm. And then there's Crispus Attucks, 47-year-old runaway slave, worked on the docks, killed in the Boston Massacre. Well, there's a great big but here. There's as many versions of the story of the Boston Massacre as old hound dog has fleas. And I'm not going to re-relate the story to you that's in the text. The facts are there. He was in a group or a mob, and he helped torment the British soldiers, and he was one of 5 that were shot and killed. Now, those are indisputable facts. But let me give you another side of the story. The Crown, who had all these young redcoats stationed over here for our protection, well, they didn't pay them very well or pay them very often. So the young men, and like I said, they were very young, they had to find part-time work to give them spending money. And just as there is screaming in this country, certain areas, about the Mexicans taking our good jobs, the same rhetoric was heard in Boston. Those dastardly redcoats are taking jobs from good Englishmen. Okay, so there was a small group of redcoats that went to the warehouse of one of Boston's most famous shippers, smugglers, and by the way, his name happened to be John Hancock. They applied for a part-time job. They spoke to the man who was there, and he said, no, there's no work here today, but if they come back the next day, they got a ship coming in, and they could help them unload it. No, John Hancock wasn't there. So the man then told his buddies about these redcoats going to show up the next day, and they got to talking, and they thought, well, it's a good chance to bash some heads. So they got together, and they waited the next morning, and the soldiers didn't show up. Next morning, the soldiers did not show up again. Well, the warehouse men were very angry, but the young men had got together and got to talk and said, that was a little bit too easy. I'm a little bit leery about what's going on, so let's don't go back. So they didn't. Now, the more the men talked, the angrier they got, and it's not unusual. They went to the local pub, and they talked about it some more, and they bragged, and they swore, and they drank, and it didn't take long before there was a rather large, rowdy crowd of drunken dockmen and sailors ready to do something to the redcoats. Was Mr. Crispus among them? I'm sure he was. But when he joined the mob at the bar, it's not clear. But he was in the forefront when they approached King Street, and he's a big man. He wasn't necessarily leading the pack. They were all just a drunken mob going down there to do something to those soldiers, because King Street's where the barracks of the young men were. When they got there was one young lone soldier, and he's standing there, and they insult him, they spit at him, they throw snowballs at rocks, and he stood there and took it. And it wasn't very long before one of the officers came out of the barracks with another group of men. Now here it gets sticky. The officer told the men to hold their fire and to stand steady, men. And the crowd knew that it was against the law for an English soldier to fire on an unarmed Englishman. So they really weren't afraid of these men standing in front of them with guns. But then someone shouted from behind the soldiers to fire, and the soldiers fired. And 5 lay dead, unarmed, innocent civilians. So the soldiers were arrested and tried for murder. They tried their best to find someone to defend them, and finally came across a young lawyer who wasn't really busy, didn't have a big practice, and He said no, he wanted no part of it because it was just, he was against the English. He didn't like the Redcoats being there in the first place. But he did believe in law, and he believed that even a guilty man should have his day in court. So, doing the lawyer thing, he started gathering some information to try to defend them. And how can you defend them? They shot the men and killed them. Everybody saw it. And he finds out that the captain or the officer who had been in charge did not order the men to fire. Somebody anonymously in the crowd behind the men had been shouting fire, and the men thought it was their captain. Well, he eventually found out who it was. It was a Boston man, and he was just trying to cause problems. So technically, the men were not guilty of murder, but they had broken the law. So they had to be punished somewhat. So they were shipped back to England, and I think a couple of them had their fingers branded. And of course, the incident was reported in the military files. But it was a terrifically unfortunate incident that happened because the men were drunk and crowding in on men with guns. But Paul Revere, our eminent silversmith in Boston, painted the infamous paintings of the Redcoats fired into the group of innocent Bostonians. And it was great propaganda. By the way, Paul Revere and Samuel Adams are the two biggest agitators of the Revolution in the Boston area. Anytime things would settle down, they would try to stir them up by starting rumors, and usually false rumors. So now, if you lived in Lexington, Kentucky, or Charleston, South Carolina, you wouldn't know anything but what you'd read, what people told you. So you would have no reason not to believe that painting by Paul Revere of the soldiers standing in a line shooting at a group of innocent civilians. So think about it for a while. You didn't have CNN. You didn't have Fox News. But if you're really interested in finding out what happened, go to PBS online, History's Mysteries, and request the reenactment of the Boston Massacre. I think you'll be surprised at what you find out. Okay, back to our text. Another historical black figure mentioned is, of course, Phillis Wheatley. Very interesting story. But Miss Wheatley, yes, she was captured in Africa and brought to this country as a slave, and the Wheatleys purchased her. But that's where it really ends, because she never knew the rigors of slavery. They treated her like a daughter. She had her own room. She could read. She could write. She wrote poetry. She was introduced to Bostonian society. Once her poems got published, she was taken to London and received in court. And yes, she did get her freedom back. Eventually, the Wheatleys did free her. She did get married, but unfortunately, she died poor and alone. How many slaves can you name that actually went to London and were received in court? I can only think about 4, and she's one of them. So to say that she's not an original or an exception to the rule is to be very naive. This woman was quite exceptional, black or white, but she was an aberration. She was not the norm in any way, shape, or form. Now, slave owners feared rebellions if they were allowed to have guns. Unrest? Yeah. There was some unrest, and there was even some who knew about the upcoming fight. Now, Governor Lord Dunmore, Virginia, because we still have the royal governor, we haven't had the official declaration yet. He issued a proclamation that blacks, slaves, or freers, or indentured servants could join His Majesty's army and gain their freedom. Then he proceeds to hide gunpowder so the rebels can't get it, because when you stop and think about that business at Lexington, Concord, it all came about because the rebels had raided a warehouse for the English powder and guns. They were good at doing that. So he hides the powder so they can't get at it. Then he officially issues the proclamation. And more than 1,000 black men showed up. And they were given uniforms. They were put in their unit called the Ethiopian Regiment. But what your text doesn't tell you is they didn't have any guns. Most of them were given what I call scut duty, which is KP, driving wagons, digging ditches, things the white man didn't really want to do. But the war is dragging on, and it gets harder and harder to get white recruits. They did allow them in some states, except Georgia and South Carolina. And according to your text, there wasn't any battle in the Revolution that you couldn't see a black face. But that story about James Wharton, I really admire that man. He turned down a chance to live in England and be free, to stay a prisoner of the British so he would not betray his country. Very interesting man. Then it mentions Prince Whipple and Oliver Cromwell, and they were with Washington when they crossed to Delaware. Now, tax system, he helped capture an English general with his head, and I must admit, I had never heard that story before. and I thought it was kind of funny. Lemon Haynes helped repel Lord Burgoyne. Now, Lord Burgoyne was an English general who had this idea if he brought British troops down from Canada into New York, he could cut the revolutionary forces in half. Well, of course, it didn't happen, and he was defeated in New York by the New York militia. But the story they tell you of Pompey is what I call a little bit off. The black soldier who made Stone Point fort capture possible? Not quite. Facts, yes, secret information did help the rebels capture the fort, but Pompey was not a soldier. He was a slave to a local farmer who happened to be a patriot. And every evening he would take vegetables and fruits down to the fort and sell them to the men. Well, the people on the day shift heard that, all the night shifts get all this good food to eat. So they want to know why Pompey wouldn't bring them stuff. So when they questioned him, he said, well, during the day it's high tide and the fort's surrounded by water, and I don't know the password to get out to bring you all anything. So they gave him the password because he gained their trust. He had good food to eat. Well, as soon as he got the password to cross the water and get to the fort, he immediately told his owner. His owner told Washington, and Washington gave orders to capture the fort with the information. So Pompey did help, but he was not granted his freedom for helping. His owner gave him a horse and allowed him to not work the rest of his life. And he did die a slave, not a soldier. Now, all the names that you listed in your book should be read very carefully because they deserve to be remembered. But most of the men's names mentioned are actually from Massachusetts. Now, I don't mean to say that other black men didn't serve in other militias, because North Carolina, Georgia, Vermont, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts all had blacks in their militia. But the official Continental Army policy was only for free blacks could serve. And it wasn't but a few months into our confrontation that the order to not enlist any blacks, boys, or old men was given. And of course, we know who led the objection, South Carolina. But news of Dunmore's proclamation said some loyalists to the Patriots' side. An example of that is when the English managed to capture New Jersey, they turned the Hessians, the mercenary soldiers, loose. And the Hessians couldn't tell by looking at the Americans whether they were patriot or loyalists, and it didn't seem to matter. They raped and they ravaged and turned a lot of good people who were for the crown against the crown because they didn't control their soldiers. Well, the same thing is going to happen down here. Some of the plantation owners who had been loyalists all of a sudden decided, no, if he's going to offer to free my slaves, I want no part of this. And then the Virginia Convention, which is the earliest government in Virginia before the war starts, they issues that proclamation that runaway slaves should return to their masters and be forgiven. And like I say, I can count the number who returned on one hand and have 5 fingers left. Nobody came back. Even if they could read, they weren't going to come back. But Washington's alarmed by this request, by this statement or proclamation, and he requests from the Continental Congress to be able to enlist blacks. He was told, well, only free blacks could, and only if they'd served before. And I don't think that all the slaves that ran away went to the British or went to join the Revolutionary Army. I think your text mentions that Thomas Jefferson wrote that Virginia alone lost 30,000 slaves. And we know that there was only 5,000 enlisted in the military. But Clinton, the overall commander of all the British troops in the country, issues a statement that all runaways that seek British help or to serve will be granted freedom. But if they're serving or working for a patriot, they're going to be captured and resold back into slavery. Now, James Armistead Lafayette was not a soldier, but a civilian spy who deceived General Cornwallis by working as a double agent. And he did gain his freedom as payment. And then your text mentions the Fontage Legion, free Haitian blacks who helped Haiti gain freedom. And some of those down there had got their ideas and tactics from the American Revolution. But British did not allow all the blacks that came to them to be free or to go back to English colonies, because when the war is over, when the English left Savannah and Charleston, New York, and St. Augustine, they did take some with them. They took 5,000 to the Bahamas, where they had to plant cotton. And some of them wound up back in slavery. So as the saying goes, the more things change, the more they stay the same. But this dispersion of American blacks caused revolutionary ideas And American culture could be taken to other countries, predominantly the Caribbean and Central America, till the war's over. Like I said, the blacks in the North who served usually got their freedom and their family. Blacks in the South who ran away or served with the British, of course, were re-enslaved. They were not freed. But meanwhile, again, in the middle colonies, in the middle states, Pennsylvania primarily leading the way, anti-slavery groups are beginning to form, and not just the Quakers this time. Other people are starting to talk about is it right to enslave somebody? Even our esteemed Alexander Hamilton, our first Secretary of the Treasury, spoke out against slavery. But I thought that was so amusing that George Washington actually tried to get some of his runaway slaves back. Now, this is just a let me think a minute tactic. I was appalled that your text spends such a little bit of time. It only spends 2 pages explaining what was going on in the country after the war and the Constitutional Convention. And I will try to condense it, but I'm going to tell it my own way. I mean, this is just not enough. What the heck? What in the world? Okay, now I'm back where I should be. I'm sorry. I hit the wrong button. I hit N instead of page down. Okay. Revolutionary War and its aftermath. We call ourselves the United States, but we are not. We're the 13-disc United States. And each of those new states that have formed, all 13 of them, they're behaving like individual countries. But in their defense, the states and new states, Massachusetts and others too, they're trying to raise taxes. Oh, the dreaded tax word. Their operating expenses of the new government. But they're not taking into consideration that most of the able-bodied men have been fighting in the war. So farmers who couldn't pay because they'd been off in the war, their farms are confiscated. Well, one war veteran, Daniel Shays, gathered together all the other upset farmers who'd lost their land, and they started to march on Boston. They were going to demand something be done. After all, the armed force had worked before against England. Well, the Massachusetts militia was called out, and the revolution did fail before it got going good, but it's kind of a tempest in a teapot. They were veterans, yes, but they didn't have a lot of weapons. And I thought it was so strange that Prince Hall, who was a war veteran, a very famous one, who was an African American, marched with the Boston militia. So no matter how you look at it, things are not going well. And this was a gigantic bell ringer. Things are not going well in the new country. Now, each state has its own rules, its own militia, its own tax system, and even its own navies. Connecticut and New York, they're actually firing at each other over border disputes. And this new national government, the Continental Congress, and our new Constitution, the Articles of Confederation, they're powerless. They couldn't tax, they couldn't arbitrate disputes between states, they couldn't pass laws. All state powers in the hands of the individual states. And trade between the states was difficult, if not impossible. It'd be like the people in Indiana putting such high tariffs that the people of Kentucky couldn't cross the Ohio River to trade with people. So a group gets together and meets at Mount Vernon, at, of course, General Washington's home. They're going to discuss trade, and there were representatives from Virginia and Maryland and Delaware. And they sit down and they have their tea and they talk, and they reach an agreement. So I thought, well, if we can talk and reach an agreement, why can't we get a representative from each of the states together and discuss changing the Articles of Confederation to maybe give the new federal government some more power to do some things? So they agreed to contact all the colonies and meet in Philadelphia in the summer of 1787 for talk to discuss changing the Articles of Confederation. Well, Georgia didn't send anybody. She said she just agreed with anything Carolina said because she had too many slaves down there to have the white man leave. And altogether, 57 different delegates arrived from 12 of the states. John Adams and Patrick Henry were conspicuous by their absence because John Adams was in France working on a treaty, and Patrick Henry said he wouldn't go. It was a trick to take all the power away from the states. George Washington was there, and I think if our esteemed Washington hadn't been there, nothing would have been done because he had a very calming effect on everybody. So 3 hot months later, no revisions, just a new constitution. Now, some of the ideas that were tossed out, why don't we have a parliament type of government like they have in England? Or have a government where we got 1 house legislature, or have one that's got 2 houses. Well, it was decided to have a 2-house legislature. They were going to have the upper house called the Senate, and there were going to be two representatives from each state would be there. So whether you were New York, the big state, or whether you were Rhode Island, a small state, you'd have two representatives in the Senate. The lower house was going to be based on representation and called the House of Representatives. It's called the Great Compromise. Well, South Carolina says, oh, wait just a minute, folks. I think I need to count my slaves for representation. I mean, y'all got more people up north than we got down here. And they said, no, we're not going to let you count a slave. But after much talk, and South Carolina says, I refuse to sign this thing. They did agree to count the slave as 3/5 of a person. It's called the 3/5 Compromise. And this is what started a lot of the debate that the Constitution is a pro-slavery document. Then the group wanted to stop the Atlantic importation of slaves in South Carolina. I beg your pardon, y'all. That law cost me an awful lot of slaves. I need to replenish my supply. Okay. No, we want to get into it. Well, I just refuse to sign this here document. Okay. So we'll ban the importation after 20 years. That'll give Carolina plenty of time to replenish her stock. Thank you, sir. Now, the business of returning runaway slaves caused no debate whatsoever. Meanwhile, this area called the Northwest Territory, see, this is the Mississippi. Here's Kentucky, and here's the Ohio going up in here. All this area is going to be new states, and it's called the Northwest Territory. And a bill was pushed through to allow the organization of the area to, survey it and lay it out and hopefully make up 10 or 12 states or whatever it was. They didn't know how many states were going to be made, but they were going to make rules to set it up. And one of the rules they made was no slavery. So basically what they've done is they put a fence around the South. Pretty much follows the Ohio River and on west. And the new territory, the new states that are going to be made will have no slavery. Now the South and South Carolina did not object at this point in time because, well, they had a lot of land out there to the west, and there just wasn't that much big a deal right now. So if those Yankees wanted to keep that slave free, let them go ahead. Because most of the new states were writing constitutions with no slavery anyway. But that fence is the very first effort by the Yankees, if you would, to eliminate the spread of slavery. Of course, the word slavery is not even mentioned in the new Constitution. They call it other persons or such persons. Now, your text does not give any details of battles to get the Constitution ratified, or the deals made to get votes from the states. And one of the deals made, and I don't think it even mentioned in the next chapter, is that they had 9 people ready to ratify this Constitution. And New York was one of the states that wouldn't ratify, and so was Virginia, 2 of the biggest states. So they got to talking to Jefferson, and Jefferson, please talk to your people and get Virginia to come over to our side of the board. No. He said, well, I tell you what, one of the provisions is we're going to have a capital and a president. What if we put the capital in the South? And Jefferson thought about it. He says, you mean not have it in New York or Philadelphia? And he said, no, we'll put it in the South. Okay. So Jefferson got together and got Virginia to vote for it. And he wrote in his diary later that it was the worst deal he ever made in his life. Now, we don't have political parties. We have political fractions or political opinions. And, of course, they're going to be called by name. And the ones called Federalists were the group that wanted a strong federal government. And General Washington and John Adams are leading this group. And the ones against it, big deal, called Anti-Federalists. Although later they're going to be called Democratic Republicans or Jeffersonian Republicans. But right now, they're just Anti-Federalists. They want the states to remain powerful. And they're led by Thomas Jefferson and John Madison. We get more into this in the next chapter.